For a long time, we created layouts with CSS by using floats. The problem is floats are not really meant to be used like this to create grid layouts. Then Flexbox came around and it was a big improvement, but not perfect since Flexbox is mainly a one-directional system. Thankfully, CSS Grid Layout is now available and adopted by all major browsers. So in this short course, you'll learn the basics of working with it. Here's a breakdown of the course structure. First, we'll take a moment to discuss what exactly is grid and how it compares with older layout methods. Then we'll look closely at the terminology behind the system. In lesson 3, we'll dive straight in and learn how to create a grid container. Then we'll define our layout by creating rows and columns so that in lesson 5 we can start placing elements on the grid. Finally, in lesson 6, we'll talk about browser support. I'm Adi Pordila. Let's get started with lesson number 1. See you there. Grid layout is the newest and probably the most powerful layout system we currently have in CSS. It basically divides your web page into rows and columns and gives you the ability and flexibility to position your elements in those rows and columns basically anywhere you want within that grid. Now, what's nice about it is the fact that the positioning is done via CSS and not HTML. So if at some point you decide you want to change the position of certain elements, you can do that very easily from CSS without having to modify your HTML source code or your markup, which is just fantastic. This also lends itself very well when creating responsive web pages, because you can use media queries to affect the position of certain elements within your page at different screen widths. Something that was very hard, if not impossible, to do with older or more traditional layout methods. So coming up, we're going to take a look at virtually the same layout that I've created using 4 different methods. So it's a very simple layout, one that you would probably find in every web page. It consists of a header, a sidebar, main content, and the footer. So I created this layout using Bootstrap, Foundation, using floats, just like the old traditional method, and finally using CSS Grid. So you're going to see the difference in the markup code that we had to write. So jumping into CodePen, this is the layout I was talking about. It's very simple. I simplified this for the sake of the demo here. But we basically have a header, sidebar, main content, and footer. And of course, this is a responsive layout, so it adjusts according to the screen width. The first example that you see right here is built with Bootstrap. So with Bootstrap, I use the class of container, and then for each row of content, I added a div with a class of row, and then for the actual element, I added a class of col or col MD4 depending on the situation. So here the sidebar is a col MD4, which basically means on the normal 12 grid system, this occupies 4 columns. Or I should say the 12 column grid system. This occupies 4 columns. And the main, which you see here in orange, just has an auto width. All right, so this is the code necessary to build this layout with Bootstrap. Now, scrolling further down, we're going to find the foundation alternative. So here I also made a grid container, and then for each of these rows, I created a grid that goes on the x-axis, so horizontally, and each element then has a class of cell, and depending on the element, I added an additional sizing class. Like you can see here on the sidebar, we have the medium 4, which means on medium screens and up, this occupies 4 columns. The demo class that you see here and also throughout this entire layout is just for styling these elements and giving them colors and padding and stuff. It has really nothing to do with CSS Grid. Scrolling further down, we can find the floats demo, right? This is the entire markup right here. This is actually simpler than the two we had before. We just have a container to center this entire grid on the page and give it a width. And then we added the header, a div with a class of clearfix because the aside and the main are floated to the left. So I needed a way to clear those floats. So I added a clearfix to the parent. And then the footer has a simple class of demo. No additional styling is required here. Now here's where it gets interesting. This is the layout that I've built with Grid. And taking a look at the markup, that's it. I have a div, class demo grid. This is necessary. This is the grid container, as we'll learn in a future lesson. And then I just lay out my elements like this. I have the header, the aside, the main, and the footer. And just by using CSS, let me jump into the CSS here, to the CSS Grid Layout. So just by using CSS, I'm able to get the layout that I want, which is also responsive, right? But by using Grid, I actually did something that was not possible with the other methods. So notice on the other methods, we are keeping the same structure that we have in the markup. So it's header, sidebar, content, footer. This is the same for the first 3 layouts. But when we get to the CSS Grid Layout, we have the header, the main content, then the sidebar, and then the footer. So we basically swapped the positions of the sidebar and the main content. And we did that without changing the HTML. So in the markup, we see we have the header, sidebar, content, and footer. This is one of the great things about CSS Grid. You can basically position your elements in any way you want just from CSS. Now, as I was saying in the beginning of the video, this is something that was really hard, if not impossible, to do with other layout methods like you saw here. I believe the frameworks, Bootstrap and Foundation, their grid system has an ordering system, right? Or they have an ordering feature that allow you to basically change the order of certain elements. That's because it's using or they're using Flexbox. So I guess that's achievable at some degree, but you still need to add different classes and stuff, and it doesn't make for a clean markup. I mean, let's look at the difference between, like, for example, the Bootstrap code, which goes from here to here, with all the rows and columns and sizing classes and all that stuff. So compare this with this. This is much more semantic. We eliminate the need of extra markup, which just makes our job a lot easier. And being able to control the positioning, the sizing, everything from CSS is just fantastic. So that was just a quick introduction to CSS Grid. Don't worry if you don't understand how this works just yet. We're going to cover that in more detail in the following lessons. But for now, let's take a look at the terminology associated with this new system. See you in the next lesson. Let's take a closer look at the terminology for Grid. And none of this is out of the ordinary because the concepts are really very simple, but we still need to go through it in order to understand how this works. And I'm sure some of these notions will sound familiar because, well, they're used to describe a grid system, and we've dealt with the grid systems before, right? So here we go. Let's start with the grid container. This is the element that will hold your grid together. It's the parent element of the grid items, and it can be whatever element you want, really. The body, a div, a main, a footer, a header, it doesn't really matter. Then we have grid items. These are any direct descendants of the grid container. So careful here, direct descendants, so not grandchildren, not great-grandchildren, direct descendants. This can be any element you place in your grid container. So it can be a paragraph, a div, an anchor tag, whatever it is, that's considered to be a grid item. As long as, of course, it's a direct descendant. So it's not like 3 levels deep in the DOM tree. It's just the first level in the parent. Then we have the grid lines. And the grid lines will basically divide the grid to create the correct structure. And lines can be vertical and horizontal. Now, on a typical grid, the lines start from number 1 on the left side for vertical, and of course number 1 on the very top for rows or for horizontal lines. And they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how you define your grid, how many columns you want in your grid, how many rows you want in your grid, and so on. We have grid tracks, and a grid track is basically a row or a column. You can also look at it as the space between 2 adjacent grid lines. So for example, if a grid starts at line 1, then it has line 2, the space between line 1 and 2 is basically a track or a column in our case. The space between, let's say, row line 2 and row line 3, that's also a track, and in our case it's a row. A grid cell is the intersection between a grid row and a grid column. It's basically one unit of the grid. And then finally we have grid area. This is an area defined between 4 grid lines. A grid area has at least one cell and is always rectangular in shape. So it can be a square or a rectangle, but never a wonky shape like an L or something along those lines. It doesn't work like that. And that's a very quick look at the terminology of using CSS Grid. Now, let's start with some actual examples and learn more about how to work with CSS Grid. We'll begin in the next lesson by learning how to define a grid container. Coming up. Let's create a grid, shall we? The very first step is to create a grid container. That's the parent element. It's what holds the grid together. It's the parent element of the grid items. And it can be anything you want, basically. The body, a div, a list. The list can go on. So let's keep things simple. I'm going to use a div with a class of container. Now, this class name is totally random. It doesn't have to be container. It doesn't have to be grid. It doesn't have to be anything, really. As long as you can target or reference this element properly in CSS, you don't need a class name. You don't need an ID, right? What's important is the CSS, not the name or the class name you give that particular element. So in my CSS, I'm going to target the container and I'm going to set display grid. And that's it, really. There are two options basically here. You can set a display grid or you can set a display to inline grid. Now the difference between these two modes is that display grid creates a grid container box that is block level, and the other one, inline grid, creates a grid container box that is inline level. That's all there is to it. For this demo, we're going to stick with display grid. So now, any kind of element that we're going to add in our container will be considered a grid item. So let's add a few. I'm going to use the class of item, although this is also arbitrary. It can be whatever you want. And I'm going to simply say item 1. Let's duplicate this like 4 times. Item 2, 3, and 4. So if we run this, we'll just see item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And just to make this a little bit clearer, I'm going to add a simple demo style. I'm going to say it's not necessary for grid. I'm simply going to style that item. I'm going to give you a background color, something like this, and let's give it a color of white, and also give it a padding of 1 rem, for example. Now, you might say, well, we don't have any rows and columns. What's going on? That's because we haven't defined them. By default, grid will simply create a flow layout, as you can see here. It goes from top to bottom in a single column. And now, if we want to position the elements and create columns and stuff, we have to define them. And we'll learn how to do that in the next lesson. Once you define a grid container, you need to define the rows and columns. If you remember from the terminology video, we have tracks, right? And a track is the space between 2 adjacent grid lines. So if we're talking about the space between column 1 or column line 1 and column line 2, then we have a track that way, vertical. If we're talking about row line 1 and row line 2, that space between those row lines is another track. It's a row, it's horizontal. So the column and row definition is applied to the grid container in CSS, and it goes something like this. We start with the columns or the rows, it doesn't really matter. Let's do the columns first. Grid, template, columns, and then in here you would basically define how you want your columns to look like. And you do that with a list of items separated by a space. So if I were to say I want 3 columns each of 100 pixels in width, I would do this: 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and 100 pixels. And there's a little typo here, and there we go. We now have 3 columns, each 100 pixels in width. Now we have 4 items, and Grid used something called the auto-placing algorithm. We'll cover that in the next lesson, to place the 4th item in the next row. Now currently the rows have an automatic height, but what if we want to set a different height to them? Well, we can do that by using grid template rows. So depending on how many rows we want, we do the same thing. We create a list with the items separated by a space. So let's say we want 2 rows, right? So let's say one row should be 100 pixels in height, and the other row should be 200 pixels in height. Okay, so now we have 2 rows, one that's 100 pixels in height and the other that's 200 pixels in height. And that's the easiest way to define rows and columns within the grid. Now, if you want a shorthand notation for these two, there is one. It's called grid template. And it basically goes grid template columns and grid template rows. And you would replace these with the actual values that you want. So, it goes rows and columns. So it's the other way around. So for example, I would replace grid template rows with 100 pixels, 200 pixels. And I would replace this with 100, 100, and 100. And it's exactly the same as doing these two independently. So you define rows first, columns after that. Now I'm going to use the normal code here, just to make things a bit clearer. Now, what kind of units can you use when defining these rows and columns? Well, you can use pixels, as you saw. You can use percentages. So if you want, for example, 2 columns, each having half the available width, you would say 50%, 50%. And that would create 2 equal columns in width. Same goes for rows. You can use other units here as well. So for example, you can use viewport height to get the height of the viewport. So you can say something like, I don't know, 25 viewport height and 75 viewport height. So the first row will be 25% of the viewport height, the other will be 75%. You can use ems, you can use rems. Also, with grid, you can use a very cool new unit called FR, or a fraction. And this basically refers to a fraction of the available space. So here's how it works. Let's go back to our columns here. And I'm going to say 1FR. And 1FR basically means take a fraction of the available space. And because we just set one column, that column spans the entire available space. If I were to say 1FR, 1FR, then the browser calculates, well, let's see how many FRs we have, how many fractions. We have 2 fractions. Yeah, 1FR plus 1FR equals 2 fractions. So we divide the available space in 2. And the first column receives 1 fraction of that space, which is half. And the second column receives another fraction. I can say, for example, 1FR, 1FR, 2FR. So what happens now? The browser calculates how many fractions we have. 1, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So we divide the available space in 4 and we get the width of a fraction. So we apply that width to the first column, which is 1FR, to the second column, again, which is 1FR, and to the third column, it has 2 fractions. So we get that 1 unit and we multiply it by 2. And we get the width of the third column, which is also great. So that's the FR, or fraction unit. Something else that's really cool about the whole grid syntax is the repeat function. So let's say, for example, that for your rows, let's say you want to have 2 rows that are 100 pixels each, right? Well, instead of repeating yourself like this, you can simply say repeat. The first parameter is the number of repetition, you want 2, and the second parameter is the value that you want to be repeated, 100 pixels. So this is exactly the same as saying 100 pixels, 100 pixels. Yeah, it's exactly the same. If you have 3 values like this, so you have 3 columns, you simply change the repeat here. And it does exactly the same thing. So if I were to have like a funky layout like this, 1FR, 1FR, oops, right? So we have this layout where we define 5 columns, each with 1FR. Well, I can replace this syntax with repeat 5 times 1FR. And it does exactly the same thing. Now, I want to show you something cool. And this is a tool inside Firefox. I'm not sure if Chrome or the other browsers have it. Let me just change the view here to a full page, for example. And we're going to inspect this grid. Now, by default, Firefox has a grid inspector. So if you go to Layout, we have the div container that's defined right here. I can also click on this little target icon and it takes me directly in my source code, and it also shows me a label here where it says grid. With this label, I can immediately see that my element is defined as a CSS grid. And you can also see a representation right here on the left. Well, what's nice about this, this inspector is that I can turn on the overlay grid, and this is so cool. I can display the line numbers. I can display area names. We haven't really talked about area names, but you can do that if you want. And you can also get a representation of the grid right here. So currently, yeah, we have it defined as 5 columns. And let me just open this in the editor mode so we can make some changes here on the fly. So I have defined this as 5 columns of 1FR. And we can see the representation here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. I also have 3 rows defined, each 100 pixels. So in here we have 1, 2, 3 rows. And you can see that the browser highlights those specific areas on the left side, which is fantastic. So if I were to change my layout to, let's say, 4 columns, let's save that. Let's also do a refresh here. Now you'll see that we now have 4 columns. So what's great about this, this inspector is that you can see the grid lines. Yeah, here's grid line 1, or row line 1, row line 2, row line 3, and row line 4. And for columns, also we start from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now notice, for a 4-column grid, we have 5 column lines. So we always have 1 extra line because the very first line starts at the edge of our grid container. Also, we can see, I'm not sure if you can see all of these, but we have some negative lines here. So you can reference to the grid lines by using their positive value, and it goes from left to right. Or you can use their negative value and they go the other way around. So for example, grid line 5, in our case, is also considered grid line -1. Grid or column line 4 is also known as column line -2. And the same thing goes for the row lines as well. I'm going to just resize this so you can see all of them. There we go. So it starts from the very bottom. Right, so row line 4 is considered to be row line -1 and goes in the opposite way, so from bottom to the top. Finally, I want to show you how to create grid gaps or gutters. A gutter is basically the space between 2 grid columns or 2 grid rows, or to keep to the terminology, a gap is the distance between 2 tracks. So to create a grid gap, you'd basically say grid gap, and let's say 10 pixels. So that would create a 10 pixel distance between the grid items. And it does that for both rows and columns. So if I were to change my layout to have 3 columns, so that we can display the 4th item on the 2nd row, you can see that we have 10 pixels between columns and 10 pixels between rows. You can of course change the gap between columns and rows individually. So if I say 10 pixel, 20 pixel, oops, I meant to do that. So you just need a space here. 10 pixel, the first one refers to the gap between rows. 20 pixels refers to the gap between columns. So I'm going to save this, and now if we go back, you'll see those changes reflected in the grid as well. If we take a look at the grid inspector in Firefox, you can see how the gaps are being represented. All right, now these elements were placed automatically on my grid by the browser using its auto placement algorithm. More about that in the next lesson. But how do you place these items individually or manually? How do you place them exactly where you want? Well, we'll learn about that in the next lesson. In the previous 2 lessons, you learned how to create a grid container and also how to define the grid rows and the grid columns inside that grid container. Now, in order to place elements inside your grid, you basically have two options. Number one, you can let the browser automatically place the elements for you, or two, you can place those elements manually by using certain CSS properties on the actual elements. Now, option number one, let's talk about that for a little bit, because by default, the browser has something that's called an auto placement algorithm. And that algorithm will basically take your items, your grid items, in the order they're defined in your markup, and it's going to start to place them starting from the top left corner and going to the bottom right corner, and it's going to place each one in one cell and then move on to the next cell, and it's going to place the second item. The third item is going to place it in the third cell. It really depends on your layout. Now, one quick note here: if the layout direction property is set to RTL, which is right to left, then the auto placement algorithm will place these items in reverse order. So it's going to go from top right to the bottom left. To show you that in a better perspective, I'm going to change the view here. Let's say to full page. So I'm going to use the example that we've worked on previously, right? So here's our grid. Our layout direction is set to default, basically. So in our markup, we have item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see how the grid places them. We have 3 columns and 3 rows. So it places item 1 in the first cell, item 2 in the second cell, item 3, and then it goes to the next row, item 4, item 5, item 6, if we ever had that many. So if, for example, I were to go back to my editor and change, let's say I want 2 columns, and I'm gonna remove the rows. By removing the rows, the browser will, it doesn't mean that you don't have rows anymore. No, the browser will automatically create rows for you, and it's going to size them according to the content that you have in those rows. So let's also add a few more items. Let's add, like, I don't know, 3 more. So it's going to be item 5, 6, and 7. So notice how the browser just automatically filled in that grid. Let's go back to our inspector here. Yeah, so it went item 1, 2. Okay, so we just have 2 columns. Fine, let's move on to the next row. Item 3, 4. There it goes again. We create another row, 5, 6, and 7. So that's how the auto placement algorithm works. The browser scans your markup. It takes the items in the order that you set in the markup, and it starts placing them in the grid. Now, if you want more control over that, if you want to place your items individually within your grid, then you can use certain CSS properties that will allow you to do that. And to demonstrate, I'm going to create a new demo here. And basically, I want to replicate the layout that I showed you when we did the comparison between Bootstrap, Foundation, Grid, and all that stuff. So it's a very common layout, right? In almost every website nowadays, you can find a header, you can find a sidebar, main content, you can find a footer, right? So let's try and recreate that and see how we can place elements in our grid. To do that, I've copied some demo styles from that particular demo. This is just to set background colors, a little bit of padding and a border radius to each individual demo unit. So in the HTML, I'm going to start with a div class grid, but again, as I said, this can be any name you want. So we're going to have a header. I'm going to give it a class of demo. I'm going to say header. And then I'm going to have an aside, also with the class of demo. And this will be our sidebar. I have a main with a class of demo. This is the main content. And a footer with a class of demo. This is the footer. All right. So this is what we have so far. Now, let's go back to CSS. We're going to target our grid. I'm going to set display to grid. And then, let's say I want the traditional 2-column layout for my grid. So I'm going to say grid template columns. Let's say 1FR, 2FR. So far, so good. Let's also save. I'm going to change the view here so you can actually see how the grid works. Right? So we have 2 columns defined. The rows are filled in automatically by the browser. Now, let's say that I want the header to span the entire width. Well, how would I do that? Well, I can go into my header and I can say this, grid, column start. I can specify the line number at which I want that to start. So if I want it to start right here at column line 2, I can simply go and say start at line 2, and it's going to start right there. Yeah. It's too bad this doesn't refresh automatically. It would have been interesting, but oops, I need to save it first. Right? So now our header starts at row line 2, at column line 2, excuse me. But maybe I wanted to go the full width, as I was saying. So I can start at line 1, which is also the default behavior, so we can ignore this altogether, but I'm going to leave it here just so you can see the syntax. And I can specify column end. So at what grid line do I want this to end? Well, I can end it at number 3. So I can say grid column end 3. And that's going to go from line 1 to line 3. Now, let's say, for example, that I'm going to change the number of columns in my grid. I'm not going to have 2 columns. Let's say I want 3 columns, right? So I can say something like 1FR, 1FR, 2FR. Well, in that case, my header does not go the full width. It goes from grid line or grid column line 1 to grid column line 3. And you can see that better represented here. Yeah, it goes from 1 to 3 because we now have 3 columns. We have 4 column lines. But also notice that -1 always represents the very last column line. So we can use that to our advantage. I can say grid column end -1. And this will make sure that that element ends always at -1 or always at the end of the grid, no matter how many columns I have defined, which is fantastic. There is a shorthand, and I strongly encourage you to use this. It's called grid column, and it basically sets grid column start / grid column end. So I can say 1 / -1, and it's going to be exactly the same as these two. All right. Now, the sidebar. Let's say that the sidebar is actually in an okay position here, but I want the main content to span the rest of the available space, right? So if we take a look at our grid, I want the main content to span from column line 2 to column line 4. So I can say main grid column start at 2 and go to 4. And that brings it from column line 2 to column line 4. I can also say -1, and it's always going to go to the end. Now, something else I can do here is I can say span 2, and it's going to have the exact same effect. Span followed by a number basically means span that particular number of columns. So in my case, we start from column line 2, and span 2 basically means span one column and then another column. If I were to say span 1, which is actually the default behavior, it will only span one column. So, it really depends on how you want to approach this. Let's stick with span 2. Now for the footer, I can say grid column span 3. And grid column span 3, notice that I didn't use this notation. Grid column start is actually by default 1. So you can omit that if you want. In here I just said on how many grid columns I want this element to span. In my case, I have 3 grid columns defined. I'm spanning on 3 grid columns. Now you can do the same for rows. So right now we don't have any rows defined, but let's say that we're going to define some rows. Let's say that I want, I don't know, a big row at the start that's 100 pixels. I want another one that's 300 pixels, and the footer, I don't know, another 100 pixels, right? So we have this layout currently. So let's save that. Let's do a quick refresh. Yeah. So we have row 1, row 2, and row 3. Now I can take these elements and I can specify on which row they need to start. So if I want the sidebar to start on row 1, I can do that, no problem. Let's target the aside here, and I can say grid row start 1. And that's going to move the sidebar, and it's going to start on the very first row. Now, by doing that, the grid automatically pushes the header 1 row below it. I can also specify on which row I want a specific element to end. So I can say grid row end, for example, 2. And that's going to make our aside end on row line 2, which is actually this one. But if I say grid row end 3, it's going to end on row line 3. Let me show you that again in the inspector. Yeah, so we have row line 1, row line 2, and row line 3. There's also a shorthand notation. So I can say grid row simply 1 to 3, and it's going to replace these two. It does exactly the same thing. Now, with this, I can play around, basically. And I can say something like, well, maybe I want the sidebar to be full width from top, or full height from top to bottom. How do I do that? Well, I can say, for example, grid row 1/-1. It goes from the very first row line to the very last row line. What else? The header, let's say I want it to start from column line 2. The main content also starts from column line 2. And let's say I want the footer to start from 2 as well. All right? Or maybe I want the sidebar to be on the right side. We would change the header, main, and footer grid column start to 1, so they both start right here. And I would change the aside starting position to, let's say, -1, because -1 is the very last column line. So I'm going to say -1. This should actually be for a grid column. So it starts at -1, and let's say I want it to span, well, a single column. And then I can say grid row 1/-1. So it goes from 1 to -1, which is the last one here. And the main content, let's say it goes from 1 and it spans 3. So it occupies the rest of the content. So you can see the possibilities here are endless. You can create even very funky layouts, like where the header just occupies one little space here and the main content occupies one little space here, and maybe the footer is right here. So Grid gives you this kind of flexibility and control over the grid items, and you can place them wherever you want. And as I was saying, because this is all made in CSS, you can use media queries. Like, for example, on smaller screens, I can set a media query where my sidebar will start from the left and not the right, as I have here. And my footer will be, I don't know, above the content. I can do all sorts of crazy things like that. And this just scratches the surface, basically, of what you can do with CSS Grid. It's such an amazing system. You can create really, really awesome layouts with this. I showed you the basics here, but I strongly encourage you to dig a little bit deeper and learn as much as you can about CSS Grid, because I think it's here to stay, and this is what we'll be using for layouts like in the next couple of years. Now, all of this is awesome, but what about browser support? I think that's the question that's on everyone's mind. So I'll try and answer that in the next lesson. I think CSS Grid is amazing, super powerful, so easy to use, and we now have a proper way of creating layouts with CSS. Now here comes the obvious question, but does it run in IE, Internet Explorer? And the answer to that question is yes, it does. In fact, you probably didn't know this, but it's Internet Explorer that we have to thank for the grid that we have today, because the very first specification for, or the very first proposal for CSS Grid Layout was developed by Microsoft and was shipped with the very first, or the brand new IE 10. That was back in 2012. So let's take a look at the browser support for IE and Edge. As you can see, globally, CSS Grid Layout is supported by 86.66% of all users, which is fantastic considering the fact that it's just a little bit over a year since CSS Grid officially launched. Let's take a look at IE and Edge. So as I said, Grid shipped with the brand new IE 10, so IE 10 and 11 both supported, as well as Edge, or the earlier versions of Edge from 12 to 15. Now here's the catch. These browsers only support the 2011 version of the specification, which is not as advanced as the one we get today in other browsers. As you can see here, it says partial support with prefix MS. So Grid works in these browsers, but it only supports an older version of the specification. And this older syntax, let's call it, can still do like the explicit placement in rows and columns, but it cannot do automatic placement and sizing. It's a bit limited. Now, for a full list of what it can and cannot do, go ahead and check out this great article by Rachel Andrew. You can find a link down below. In here, you can find the specific properties and values that work in the IE implementation and which ones don't work, and the ones that can be enabled by using the auto prefixer. Now, the new and improved version of Grid, which is considered to be CSS Grid Layout Module Level 1, shipped in March of 2017 in Safari, Chrome, Firefox, and Opera. So you can see that these browsers currently fully support Grid. And because of that, as I pointed out in the beginning, now 86.66% of all users globally can now benefit from Grid, which is just fantastic. Now, whether or not you want to use the old syntax to support IE, or just use the new syntax and just serve IE like a different layout, is entirely up to you. Personally, if I didn't need to explicitly support these older browsers, I would just use the new syntax. So the concept is pretty simple. For the non-supporting browsers, you serve like a simple flow layout with a simple column. And then you can use feature queries at supports to implement Grid in the browsers that support it. So for Internet Explorer and the earlier versions of Edge that support the old specification of Grid, you would simply serve a simple layout, simple flow layout. And on the newer browsers like Chrome, Safari, and so on, that do support Grid, you implement the new layout. And by doing that, you make sure that the non-supporting browsers still get something. It's a simplified layout, but still all the information is there. And the newer supporting browsers get the fancier layout. That's basically progressive enhancement, right? Now, if you want to learn more about feature queries, there is a link down below to an article from Web Design Tuts. And that concludes this introduction to CSS Grid Layout. I just covered the basics here. I wanted to give you the minimum amount of information you need to start working with CSS Grid, and I really think you should start working with this. We need to push the web forward in the right direction, and I strongly believe that CSS Grid is a great tool that will help us do that. Please stay tuned on Envato Tuts Plus for more advanced content on CSS Grid in the upcoming months. And until then, I want to thank you very much for watching this course. I'm Adi Pordila. Take care.